I want to start with a crazy question, and you're the only person who I trust to answer it. I had a shocking wave crash over me when I saw Jacob Frey, the hapless mayor of Minneapolis, basically combust when he went down to the struggle session in the streets, and he couldn't go 100% of the way to crazy and say, yes, I'll abolish the police. And they shouted, shame, shame, go home, Jacob, go home. That was an incredible moment, and I thought, who's going to be the next mayor? And I thought, I wonder if Ilhan Omar will be the next mayor of Minneapolis. What do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think if I'm looking at this from a purely political perspective, it just so happens that Keith Ellison, the attorney general who had previously served in Ilhan Omar's seat in Congress, his son serves on the Minneapolis City Council. His son is one of those who actually tweeted in support of Antifa before it was designated as a terrorist organization, and who was, of course, a supporter of this effort to defund and actually disband the police in Minneapolis. So I suspect that Keith Ellison's son is probably more woke than Ilhan Omar, and maybe he's the man for this moment in Minneapolis. But I have to say, I was so struck by that scene of the mayor prostrating himself. Even he couldn't get extreme enough for the mob. And I think what you're seeing is essentially a Marxian mob eating its own. The progressives have been in control of cities like Minneapolis for decades, and it's still not progressive enough for them. And so even someone like Jacob Frey, who comes off as so earnest and wanting to express how sorrowful he is and trying to meet the demands of the mob, even he learned the lesson that you can never concede enough to the mob. They want it all. They want total power. And so it's a lesson for those who think of themselves as liberals or progressives that you'll never get radical enough for the mob, but I don't think many of them will take that lesson to heart.
Yeah, it's incredible. I thought that this defund police or abolish police was just a shock and awe statement, a conversation starter. But it looks like, at least in some ways, they're serious about it. Now I see that same idea has spread here to Toronto, where we have a city councillor for one of the wealthier neighborhoods where people pay a lot of taxes and they have a lot of valuable houses they wouldn't want torched. He's talking about trimming back Toronto's police, even though we haven't had anywhere near the problems they've had in various American cities. Can these people be serious about depolicing? I've seen so many comments about turning Minneapolis into Mogadishu, Somalia. It's almost too ridiculous to be true, but aren't we moving towards anarchy if we actually disband police forces?
Well, it's actually amazing on that last point. There was an article in the New York Times profiling several Somali Americans, some of whom lived in Minneapolis, saying that they didn't think Minneapolis could actually turn out like Mogadishu, but it actually has. And again, you have to ask the question, how did that happen when you had these progressives running Minneapolis for all of these many decades? I think that the notion of disbanding police, I'm glad actually that the radical Marxist revolutionaries who are really behind this sort of view, I'm glad they're on record because they're exposing themselves for who they really are. And look, if you follow their line of thinking and you accept the proposition that criminals are essentially the core victims and their victimizers, the police, are really the criminals, then of course you have to disband police departments. By the way, it flows from the same viewpoint as the notion of abolish ICE. They want to abolish all authorities, essentially, that maintain law and order, at least as traditionally understood, so they can impose their own law on anyone who dares dissent from their prevailing orthodoxy. And one of the things that's really ironic in this, I would say, is that if we were to accept that systemic racism were policies and practices that ultimately led to disproportionate victimization of people of color, the idea of defunding police departments or getting rid of police, in particular from the highest crime areas of cities with large members of minorities, well, you are going to disproportionately victimize people of color. So I have to ask, what is systemically racist? I think this policy is systemically racist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that I mean, Ann Coulter, who is very aggressive on these subjects, she tweeted, there's going to be a white flight from these cities in a way we haven't seen in decades. And I think not just white flight, but any black people of means will want to get the heck out of these neighborhoods that are being depoliced and basically thrown to the wolves of anarchy. Joel Pollack, who I respect very much, has said that he believes this will set back not only the economic prosperity of many black American cities by decades, but I also think it'll set back race relations because it has so branded rioting and looting as a black thing, and not necessarily because it's black people doing it, but it's called a Black Lives Matter protest. It's in the name of George Floyd. So I don't know. I think this is the worst of all outcomes for African Americans. That's how it looks like from up here in Canada. I don't know what it looks like in the States.
I wholeheartedly agree, and my heart in particular goes out to all the people who are law-abiding that are caught up in this, many of whom have been locked down for weeks, some of whom have seen loved ones perish without being able to say goodbye in person. On the contrary, on the other hand, you have people who are the most lawless in society, destroying businesses that have sat idle for weeks, some of which have gone under, and they get to act with total impunity. And there have been some great profiles out there in a few different publications speaking with people who own businesses in any of these areas that have been destroyed essentially by the mob, by rioters and looters. And it's just heartbreaking because you see people who pursued the American dream, did everything right, and then law enforcement basically was forced to stand down, or maybe in some cases stood down its own accord, understandably, given the circumstances, but nevertheless, in contravention of the fundamental principle of law and order and the fact that you need to have protection of life, liberty, and property if you're going to have a functioning society. It's really the basis of the American system. Absolutely. Those who are going to be most hurt are the law-abiding people who live in the areas that are going to be hollowed out, destroyed, and left defenseless. And by the way, of course, many of the American cities with the greatest crime problems also have the harshest strictures on gun ownership. So not only are you going to have less policing or maybe no policing in certain cities, but then if you're living in a high crime neighborhood and you can't afford to get out of it, you're not going to be able to defend yourself from the mob, from the lawless anarchy that you described. So it's absolutely disastrous, and it really puts civilization into question itself. If you don't have law and order and people aren't able to defend themselves, and then you're going to victimize the people that, if you're on the left, you claim to care about most. You claim to care about those who are living in the poorest neighborhoods, in high crime neighborhoods, and the like. You really are proving that you don't believe at all in your principles. You just believe in the revolution at the end of the day.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.